The Jews of Israel and the Palestinians have been fighting for much of the last 100 years. In a land where history is not just a memory, but a living, breathing presence, a new chapter unfolds. The Israel-Palestine Conflict, a saga of bloodshed and tears, dreams and despair, is more than a mere territorial dispute. It's a narrative etched into the soul of the land and its people. To truly understand this conflict, we must take a look at the world as it was in 1918, a world reshaped by the Great War. In this era of upheaval, the seeds of today's turmoil were sown. Key figures emerged, promises were made and broken, and a land cherished by many became a pawn in a global game of power and politics. Today we examine Britain's pivotal role in the region from 1918 to 1948, and how its actions laid the groundwork for decades of strife. Please see our video. This will change how you think about the Israel-Palestine conflict for more of the tragic modern history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. From 1517 until 1918, the Ottoman Turkish Empire controlled what is today Israel and Palestine. Through most of their history there, the Ottomans managed to maintain a lid on tensions between the Jews and Muslims in Jerusalem and the rest of the country. They had some advantages in doing this. The Ottomans were much stronger than either the Jews or the Palestinians. They did not care about human rights, and perhaps most importantly, there were a comparatively small number of Jews living there. In AD 70, the Romans had had enough of Jewish revolts against their rule and either killed or forced out most of the Jews living in the region. Some went east to Syria, present-day Iraq, and Iran, but most moved into the Roman Empire, scattered by force out of their homeland, seemingly forever. The origin of the Palestinian people in the area is a matter of debate. Palestinians across the political spectrum will say that they are the descendants of the biblical Philistines. This idea has been mostly rejected by mainstream scholars. These people, who may have had their roots in the arrival of the Phoenicians and other sea people in the 12th to 6th centuries BC, but the name Palestinian to describe the culture and people that live there today only became popular at the end of the 1800s. In the days before Twitter, Facebook, and the rest of the internet, when people used more than two-syllable words to explain themselves and the world around them, Great Britain, or more accurately England, was sometimes called Perfidious Albion. Alphas is the ancient Greek word for the British Isles. The name stems from that Greek word, or perhaps an old Celtic word. Both mean white, likely referring to the famous white cliffs that mark much of the English southern coast. Kind of a nice word that's been used in one language or another for centuries. The first part is not so good. Perfidious means treacherous, a person or country that violates its good faith agreements. England was known as Perfidious Albion in diplomatic circles for years, because it was seen as having a bad habit of breaking its word to other countries or territories, especially smaller ones that it might take advantage of to advance its own cause. This idea was not new, and even some of Britain's friends like the United States in 1918 were often victims of British betrayal or lies. One of the most important of its lies came during World War I and at the Conference of Paris and Versailles to end the war. President Woodrow Wilson was adamant that the post-war world would be created honestly, at least among the great powers at the conference, England, France, and the United States. Wilson had pledged to the American people that the agreement to end World War I would not be full of the same types of secret deals and protocols that had been European treaties landmarks for as long as anyone could remember. At a time when France and Britain were the strongest nations left standing in Europe, and with an American public tired of war and foreign entanglements, secret and not-so-secret agreements between Britain and France were made in Paris, despite Wilson's pressure and promises to the people back home. The most important was the division of much of the Middle East between England and France. By the end of World War I, the English, French, and nearly everyone else realized that oil would be the most important natural resource for a long time to come. Before World War I. In 1897, Theodor Herzl, a journalist and activist in increasingly anti-Semitic Vienna, announced a new movement, Zionism, which called for the return of all Jews to Israel, the land of Mount Zion, where in the Old Testament, Moses communicated with God. Zionism grew in influence throughout Europe and into Britain and the United States in the years before World War I. For the British, whose population of Jews was just over 300,000 in 1910, Zionism had its appeal, not because the British wanted the Jews who lived in Britain out, but because they believed that the influx of a large number of Jews into the Middle East could be a stabilizing factor in the region and provide the British with a new and perhaps influential ally. Be careful what you wish for, because in the case of the British, the arrival of more Jews to Palestine, as it was called then, in the years after World War I and II resulted in a less stable area, and the eventual removal of British troops and administrators from the region in 1948. Before and after World War I, Arab Muslims living across the region, from Egypt to Iraq, rejected Zionism and any call for Jews to move to the Holy Land. The Ottoman Turks, only related to the Arabs by religion, walked a fine line. They recognized that the Jews of their empire and Europe could be a stabilizing and economically rewarding factor in the region they controlled. Still, they were careful not to endorse Zionism publicly and to limit the number of Jews that were permitted into their Palestinian territory. During World War I, one of the most famous men of World War I was the British soldier, adventurer, and philosopher, Lieutenant Colonel T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia. During the war, Lawrence was tasked by the British Army with trying to unite the tribes of what is now Saudi Arabia in a fight against the Ottoman Turks, who had joined the Germans and Austro-Hungarians in the alliance against the British, French, Italians, and Russians. In return for the support of the Arabian tribes, the British pledged that at the war's end, the Arabian Peninsula would be an independent kingdom. The British also provided weapons and supported the House of Saud, the family that rules Saudi Arabia today. At the same time, British Foreign Secretary and former Prime Minister Arthur Balfour announced that the British government supported a home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This is the famous Balfour Declaration. Balfour and the British also pledged to help support the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, but also promised to ensure the rights of all of the people, of whatever religion, would be protected. This placed Britain in a difficult situation between two sides whose resentment towards each other was ancient and growing by the year. In 1922, the League of Nations voted to give Britain a mandate, or a purpose in its being there and having control, to develop the structure of a future government, and to help develop infrastructure and civil society. The problem was that many Palestinians believed that they had secured an agreement with the British during the war that threw support behind them. For Palestinians, the Hussein McMahon Correspondence is a series of 10 letters between the British High Commissioner for Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, and Hussein bin Ali, the powerful Sharif of Mecca, Islam's holiest city. In these letters, the Arabs and the British agreed to support each other. A number of other items were discussed, but to the Palestinians, the most important part was where the British promised to support Palestinian independence in the future. Now, the language of the part about Palestine is vague and can be interpreted in several ways depending on your point of view. The British believed that they had led the way to a state in a region that would be inclusive of Jews and Arabs. Hussein and the Palestinians were adamant in the letters that they would not accept a Jewish state in Palestine, but the word Palestine doesn't even come up, only vague references to specific cities and areas of control. Through the 1920s and until 1933, when Hitler came into power in Germany, Jewish immigration from Europe to Palestine increased, though it wouldn't be the flood it became after the war. With every new group of Jewish settlers, Palestinian anger and fear grew. At the same time, though a surprising number of Jewish immigrants did not practice Jewish religious traditions, most did, and all firmly believed that the Jewish people were finally going home after centuries in exile. Many of them believed they had been led there by God. On the other side, the Palestinian Muslims believed that Jerusalem, the ancient capital of Israel, had become a holy site when the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven and back in the city. They had the support of most Arab Muslims, including the House of Saud. This meant that the British were attempting one of history's trickiest diplomatic juggling acts. The British hoped that their control of Israel, along with Arabia and Iraq, would give them access to untold amounts of oil and a secure way of sending it across the Mediterranean and then home. They hoped it would be worth it. 1922 to 1948, British control. For much of British control, a simmering peace was kept. In the interest of commerce, or because the British were more powerful than either party, the Palestinians and lesser numbers of Jews attempted at times to live together, or at least near each other, without killing one another. In the 1930s and 40s, several significant events set the course leading to where we are today. Hitler came into power in 1933. As he gained power and influence in Germany and the world, he reached out to the Arab world, specifically Muhammad Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, a religious scholar who also wielded great power. In both writing and person, Hitler and Grand Mufti talked about the plans for Palestine once Hitler had won the war. In his public speeches, writings, and private conversations, the Mufti had often called for the elimination of the Jews in Palestine. You can imagine how the talks between the Mufti, Hitler, and Himmler went. Even into the first 2 years of World War II, Hitler hoped he could convince Turkey to join the war or at least allow German troops to move through its territory and into Palestine. The Turks refused to allow either one. That meant Hitler's hopes for moving into the Holy Land, then into the oil-rich British and French-controlled territories of Syria and Jordan, then called Transjordan in England, Iraq and Arabia, would depend on General Rommel's success in breaking through British lines in Egypt. That never happened, and luckily the world escaped Nazi German control of most of the world's oil. But it also meant that the British Army needed every soldier in uniform in the war effort to defeat Germany in North Africa and Europe. When World War II ended, the British public was tired, and the British government was broke. Maintaining a large force in Palestine to make sure they had a stable region behind them as they fought Rommel cost a lot of money. And at the end of the war, there was an outcry to bring all the boys back home. During the war, Palestinian paramilitaries formed, and violence against Jewish settlers increased. In turn, the Jews began to develop their own militias and paramilitary groups, the most famous of which are the Haganah and the more radical Irgun. Throughout the war, there would be spikes in violence between the Jews and Arabs throughout the Mandate. At times, the British were seen to be favoring the Jews. Then the Jews would strike at the British for arresting and imprisoning Jews who were deemed to be troublemakers. Not all arrests were peaceful, and beatings by the British military were common. Sometimes Arab militants would be arrested and mistreated. By the end of World War II, the British were hated by both sides as much as they hated each other. Both sides committed atrocities. Massacres and counter-massacres occurred with gruesome regularity. On July 22, 1946, the Haganah blew up the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, the site of British headquarters in Palestine. The bombing killed 91 people, most of them British officials, though several Arabs as well as Jews were victims. The bombing is believed to have been carried out in either reprisal for British treatment of Jewish prisoners, strike at both the British command, and erode British support for their involvement in the region, while Britain was still suffering from World War II itself. It had that effect, and the arrival of an estimated 600,000 to 700,000 Jews fleeing Israel from the end of World War II to the founding of Israel on May 14, 1948, made the British position untenable, and both sides knew it. Violence increased. Where British aid to the Jews stopped after the war, U.S. aid flowed in, weapons, war supplies, and money. The Palestinians hoped that Arabs in Egypt, Jordan, and Syria would join them against the now stronger and almost as numerous Jewish population. A pan-Arab force joined with the Palestinians to destroy the state of Israel and eliminate the Jews by bullet or boat, but they lost the war. For the Israelis, this meant the re-establishment of the state of Israel. For Palestinians, it was the Nakba, the catastrophe. The British had been searching for a way out ever since the King David Hotel bombing, and they recognized the state of Israel in May of 1949. This is History on Fleek. See you next time.